Thuzar here, a member of the ASEAN Women for Peace Registry from Singapore, and I'd like to spend some time with you to talk about ASEAN and the Women, Peace and Security, or WPS, agenda. What are the priorities? Who are the people involved in addressing WPS issues in ASEAN? And what kind of policy framework we have within this region, within this regional organization to do so. And I'm offering this as a kind of a brief introduction, overview, and a quick literature review, if you will, for researchers who are interested in exploring further the ASEAN dimension to tackling women, peace, and security issues within this regional framework. It's been more than 20 years, 22 to be exact, since the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 in 2020. That was the first time that the Security Council really looked at how women are disproportionately affected by armed conflict, and also highlighting the importance of paying attention to the unique protection needs of women and girls in conflict situations, and of course the continuing priority to ensure women's participation at all levels of decision making. There have been 9 more such resolutions made by the Security Council since then. But the main foundational reference, I believe, is still 1325. We still make reference to it because it really stresses the importance of, and I quote, women's equal and full participation as active agents in preventing and resolving conflicts, in building peace, and in keeping peace. So in short, it's a much needed gendered perspective on all areas of peace processes. And it's important to note here that it is a resolution that the Security Council has passed, because if there is any resolution passed by the United Nations that has the potential to be legally binding under the UN Charter, it is the resolutions that are passed by the Security Council, as all members of the United Nations have agreed under the Charter to carry out and accept the decisions of the Security Council. So it is in this context that I focus my discussion on ASEAN and the WPS agenda. I shall look at where we have come from, what we need to think about in the current situation, and finally, what else, what more needs to be done where we want to take the WPS agenda. So let's start first with the story so far. Why ASEAN? Why women? Why women in peace processes? In the past, women's issues and concerns were under the purview of what was called the Committee on Social Development, under functional cooperation, which in today's parlance is probably equivalent now to the ASEAN Socio-Cultural community. And it started at a leaders level meeting. There was an ASEAN Women Leaders Conference in 1975 that established a mechanism to discuss women's matters and issues and concerns at the regional level, and they called it the ASEAN Subcommittee on Women. That was renamed the ASEAN Women's Program in 1981, and then at the turn of the century, in the new millennium, in 2001, elevated to a senior officials level meeting called the ASEAN Committee on Women. But up to that point, any policy level statement or commitment in ASEAN by ASEAN for women was made by the foreign ministers. Recommendations had to be brought up to the foreign ministers level. And it wasn't until 2012 that ASEAN first convened its ministerial meeting on women. There has been civil society input all through these processes. The ASEAN Confederation of Women's Organizations has a seat at ASEAN formal meetings on women, and in recent years there's also the ASEAN Women Entrepreneurs Network to talk about women's economic empowerment and opportunities. And all through this, the main areas of focus have always continued to focus on women's leadership issues. the importance of non-gender stereotyping, the importance of gender mainstreaming across all three community spheres in ASEAN, the political security, the economic, the socio-cultural, eliminating violence against women, and of course, women's empowerment in political and economic spheres, and especially for women in vulnerable situations. And so with all of this, you might want to ask, where's the human rights aspect? In 2010, the ASEAN Commission on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Women and Children, or ACWC, was inaugurated, and it was supposed to consult closely with the ASEAN Committee on Women for those cross-cutting issues. And so the ACWC, which focuses more on the human rights aspects, also looked at climate change impacts on women, as well as women's political and economic empowerment and participation. They do not report to the same ministerial level structure, however. The ASEAN Committee on Women, as I mentioned, has the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Women as its overarching policy purview. But the ACWC reports to or is under the purview of the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Social Welfare and Development. And both of these structures and entities are still within the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community pillar sphere. But of course, you know, there is also this growing recognition and evidence that gender issues are cross-sectoral. UN Security Council Resolution 1325 made that clear. It was the first of 10 United Nations Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security. And following that brought foundational framework and commitments. The ASEAN heads of state and government have also paid much more closer attention, shall I say, to women, peace and security in ASEAN. Under the Philippines chairmanship of ASEAN in 2017, ASEAN heads of state and government at the 31st ASEAN Summit issued a joint statement on promoting women, peace and security in ASEAN. And the following year, in 2018, the ASEAN Women for Peace Registry was established under the aegis of the ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, and that was within the ASEAN Political Security Community pillar. So there was that first cross-sectoral effort to bring together the different aspects of discussing issues and concerns affecting women in political, economic, or the social spheres. Now, the ACW and the ACWC also established an advisory group on women, peace, and security in 2019. And in 2020, ASEAN convened a ministerial dialogue on strengthening women's role for sustainable peace and security. There is also a Southeast Asian network of women peace negotiators and mediators. So there are all these growing recognition and efforts to make the WPS agenda in ASEAN cross-sectoral. Obviously, peace matters for ASEAN. One of ASEAN's main objectives is regional peace and stability, after all. But I think peace and security, peacemaking, conflict resolution, these are areas or topics that policymakers may still traditionally associate with men. But that's changing. Data on recurrent and emerging conflicts do show that global security challenges in the 21st century may not be resolved completely by standard peacemaking methods that we have been used to. And of course, they have cautioned that recurrence of civil war is on the rise, and recently, violent political protests have joined the categories of conflict. There is also research collected and collated by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, or International IDEA, that also suggests that inclusion of women and civil society in peace negotiations help to ensure that peace agreements are less likely to fail. And this is also because women bring to the table their unique perspective and solid understanding of the needs of their various respective communities. Women tend to be more inclusive in promoting consensus in negotiations. Women are also quite adept at working across religious, ethnic, political, or cultural divides. And women also have unique access that men probably may not have, for example, to other women. And they're also seen as less threatening, as well as wielding no minimal level of influence within their families and communities. But research also highlights that women's representation in peace processes is still lagging. And so where does all this come in for ASEAN? It's a great accomplishment for WPS that ASEAN has listed women in peace and security in the ASEAN Vision 2025 under the Political Security Community Blueprint. And, with that understanding, underpinning the launch of the ASEAN Women for Peace Registry, as I mentioned earlier, to provide that cross-sectoral approach to build on and expand ASEAN's instinctive approach of seeking negotiated compromises to problems and challenges, and to champion women's participation in peace negotiations and peace building.